Hey there guys, it's Ben with BSR Specialized Mechanics. I'm going to bring you up to speed on what happened to this truck and why it came in. Truck is here for a turbo replacement and I need to pull and inspect, flush out that intercooler. Now why did the turbo go bad? A couple months back, customer reached out to me and asked what would be a possible cause of his truck losing power. We kind of went over a few things and he ended up bringing it here. And the first thing I checked was our air filter. The air filter was clogged to a point where it sucked itself somewhat into the intake. So then he ran to the parts store, got a new air filter, and proceeded. Called me about a month later and said the problem is back, but it's a little worse and there's some noises going on when he's traveling. They brought it by and the first thing it seemed like we had was a turbo issue. Got a previous video posted on when the truck arrived on how it sounded. So without pulling it apart based off of my experience, I diagnosed it to a turbo replacement. We placed an order, I pulled the truck in and started pulling the top end apart. On these trucks, it's easier to pull the cab or drop the transmission, but I just decided to go through the top side. It's a little more difficult, but you can do it. This is your top side pulled apart. The turbo sits right in the center there. So back to how the turbo went bad and how it failed. So here's our old turbo. Let's talk about how the airflow works. So first off, this is your air inlet. Air will be drawn into our compressor wheel. Compressor wheel spins, which forces compressed air to an intercooler, and then that leads to your intake. Now the cool thing about a turbo is you got your front compressor wheel, which forces air into the intake. And that's mounted on a shaft to a rear turbine wheel, which draws air out of the exhaust side. Your exhaust goes into here, comes up and gets forced out that direction. So again, air will flow from your air box to your inlet here. This is your compressor wheel. So this is going to compress your air. It's going to spin and push air out the top. That air is going to be warm, so it will run to an intercooler, which is going to cool the air, which is going to make it more dense. Then that tube runs to your intake, enters the combustion chamber where your pistons are. After combustion, it will come out of the engine, which is your exhaust side, and enters the turbine side of the turbo, and that will spin and force air outward. How this failed is when our air filter failed, it drawn a piece up to our compressor wheel and chewed up the fins here. As you can see that caused a bearing failure. So there's your first issue, but second issue, anytime that bearing fails or spins slower than it needs to, your inner oil seal will fail. This is your upper oil port where oil flows through to cool the bearing. That allows oil into the system, which also causes damage, oils up your tubing, and clogs your intercooler, which results in part failures and improper air ratios. Thanks for joining.